Hey everyone, so I'm outside doing a little bit of exercise, taking my dog for a walk, and doing some social distancing. And so hopefully you saw my video earlier about photosynthesis. So also, while you're at home, you probably have, how to get creative working out, especially my athletes. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about right now, we're going to talk about cellular respiration. And so the whole reason why we're able to do this, why we're able to, work out, walk around, just do whatever it is we need to do, and all organisms do this, is because of photosynthesis, producing oxygen, so that way we can perform cellular respiration. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that right now. And so go ahead and stay tuned. We'll spend about 10 minutes just going over cellular respiration. All right, guys, I'm back. I have my cup of hot tea, so I'm ready to go ahead and start explaining cellular respiration. All right, so let's get started. I'm not going to promise that this is going to be 5 minutes. It's probably going to be more like 10 or 15 because there's a lot that has to do with cellular respiration. So, for cellular respiration, have you ever wondered why you need to breathe? Why do you need oxygen? So, some of you may remember our case study when we talked about cellular respiration. Remember the case of the 7 deaths when we talked about how Tylenol was dosed with cyanide, and cyanide is going to block oxygen, for the process of cellular respiration. So, let's figure out why oxygen is needed for this. All right, so remember the purpose of cellular respiration, the food you eat cannot be used directly by your cells. Tomorrow we're going to go over biomolecules. That way we can kind of explore, the different types of molecules you need and why. And so cells only have one usable form of energy. They're going to use ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So if you remember what ATP is, it's the chemical that's used to store your energy. We talked about all of these little bonds, and every time you break a bond, you're able to harvest energy. And so that's what organisms are using whenever they're storing energy or whenever they're creating energy or whenever you have energy for reactions to occur. It's because you're making and breaking bonds. So if I look at my ATP, I have my adenine, my ribose, and I have my 3 phosphate groups. Okay, so think about these phosphate groups as a battery. All of our energy is stored there. And so because these phosphate groups are just hanging off, you're able to just break one off, and whoops, when that happens, you're able to get energy. Okay, so cutting off that phosphate group through hydrolysis is going to release a ton of energy. And so we need to be able to use that food that we eat in order to gain ATP. So when you break that bond, okay, so you're going to create something called adenosine diphosphate, ADP. So ADP has some energy there, but not as much as ATP. And so during, the process of cellular respiration, we're able to restore ADP into ATP by adding on that extra phosphate group. And remember, that process is called phosphorylation. All right, so where does all this happen? This all happens in the mitochondria. So if I look at my mitochondria, it looks very similar to my chloroplast. It has this double membrane and it has all of these folds inside that is going to allow our electron transport chain to work. And so remember, the more folds that you have in a membrane, the more surface area you're going to provide for different types of chemical reactions. And so mitochondria has a smooth outer membrane and then that folded inner membrane, and that allows for cellular respiration to occur. So just in general, for cellular respiration, we're going to be taking in food products, mostly glucose, and we're going to be breathing in oxygen. One of our byproducts is carbon dioxide. We breathe that out and the plants will use it. And then another byproduct we have is water. And with that, we're going to be able to produce ATP. All right, so 3 steps for cellular respiration. Our first one is glycolysis. So remember, gluco refers to glucose, lysis is to break down. All organisms, doesn't matter if you're a plant, a fungus, an animal, bacteria, you're all going to do glycolysis. And so with glycolysis, you will produce a little bit of ATP. So step number 2, Krebs cycle. I don't know why it says step 1. So step 2, Krebs cycle, also known as citric acid cycle. Okay, step 3 is our electron transport chain. This is where we need that oxygen. It's going to make a ton of ATP. So let's go ahead and go over glycolysis. So if we look at our glucose, I'm going to move my little camera. Okay, so if we look at glucose, C6H12O6, we have 6 carbons here. And so in order for that to come into our mitochondria, we need to be able to split that in half. And so our first step, which is glycolysis, will allow that glucose molecule to get split in half. So the reason why all of the organisms in the world do this is because it occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. It's not in the mitochondria, so you don't need mitochondria to do this step. it'll be in the cytoplasm. So it's an anaerobic process. You don't need oxygen. So that's why certain bacteria, and organisms that don't, breathe oxygen can do this. And it's going to break down the glucose into two pyruvate molecules, also known as pyruvic acid. And it's broken very neatly in half. You are going to release some carbon dioxide and you get two ATP molecules. So things like bacteria that do glycolysis, they're still able to produce some energy. They just don't need a lot of it. And so when you split that glucose, okay, you end up splitting it in half. So you can see right here, it's split directly in half. Now I have two molecules, each of them has 3 carbons. And so those 3 carbons, those are my pyruvate molecules. And so during glycolysis, I'm going to be able to produce a couple of other byproducts. So let's see here. Okay, I get NADH. So if you watched my photosynthesis video, so NADPH is going to be one of my electron carriers. So for cellular respiration, NADH is another electron carrier. So the way I remember this, so photosynthesis has NADPH, P for plant, P for photosynthesis. Cellular respiration only has NADH. So I have 2 NADH molecules here that are made, and then I also have 2 ATP. So remember, your glucose split in half, and so this is for each side of your pyruvate. And so this process is going through glycolysis. So that pyruvate needs to go somewhere. If we have oxygen, it needs to go to our next step. And so this is what's called a bridge reaction. Okay, pyruvate needs to cross from the cytoplasm into the mitochondria, and it's going to go through that with an enzyme called acetyl-CoA. So just like with photosynthesis, you don't need to remember the enzymes. You just need to know that pyruvate was generated in the cytoplasm, and now it's going to enter into the mitochondria for further steps of cellular respiration. This will only happen if oxygen is present. No oxygen is present, pyruvate's not going anywhere. It's going to stay in the cytoplasm. So step 2, Krebs cycle. Okay, if you look at this, looks kind of like the Calvin cycle, just with different molecules. And again, you don't need to know all these different enzymes or these byproducts. You just need to know what the purpose of the Krebs cycle is. And sometimes it'll be called the citric acid cycle. So now we're inside the mitochondria. We have all of that surface area, and so this cycle can happen with all of those pyruvate molecules that are coming in. And so this is an aerobic process. This only happens if you have oxygen. And so acetyl-CoA is going to bring that pyruvate into the mitochondria. Carbon dioxide is going to be released. That's going to be one of our byproducts. We're going to breathe that out. And what you're going to do, the purpose of all of this is to create all of those electron carriers. Look at that. Look at all those little yellow boxes. Okay, that's a lot of electron carriers. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why we need all of those hydrogens in the end. We do produce some ATP, not a lot. Okay, so 2 net molecules of ATP are used. The main purpose of the Krebs cycle is to produce all of those electron carriers. And so those electron carriers, you get 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH2. Those are sent to your electron transport chain. So now remember, all of this is just for one pyruvate molecule. Okay, so if you look at the back of anything that you're eating, anything that you're drinking, it'll have the grams of sugar on there. Okay, so sugar is going to be one of the things that gives us energy. And so if you're looking at just 1 gram, it has hundreds of glucose molecules in there. And so, all of this process is just for one pyruvate. So it's half of a glucose molecule. And so we're getting a lot of these electron carriers and a lot of ATP from this, but it's not enough for us. We need to be able to generate more ATP. So all of this stuff is going to be sent to the next step, step 3, which is your electron transport chain. And so at this point, we've completely oxidized glucose to carbon dioxide. It's going to be breathed out as one of our waste products. And so let's see here. Okay, so Krebs cycle, it's a little joke. Okay, so what goes into the Krebs cycle? Midnight. Sorry, my dog's barking. Okay, so what goes into the Krebs cycle? Okay, so remember, your pyruvic acid or your pyruvate goes into the Krebs cycle. And then what comes out? Okay, so it's your electron carriers. You get a little bit of ATP, and then you're going to breathe out carbon dioxide. Very good. Okay, so remember, you need oxygen for this to happen. So this is going to give off carbon dioxide, and it's going to happen twice per glucose molecule, okay? Because every time the Krebs cycle happens, it's for a pyruvate, which is half of a glucose molecule. You're going to get 2 ATP, and you're going to get a bunch of electron carriers. That's the main purpose of the Krebs cycle. And this happens inside the mitochondria. Okay? All right, so next, let's talk about the electron transport chain. So now we're on the inside membrane of the mitochondria. We've brought all those molecules in, and we've been able to store them inside that inner membrane. So that inner membrane space provides a lot of area for chemical reactions to occur. This is an aerobic process. You still need oxygen. Okay, so oxygen is going to be your final electron acceptor. We'll talk about that in a second. We have all that NADH and that FADH2. It's going to drop off all of those electrons from the outside of that mitochondria, so from your Krebs cycle. At the end of this, you're going to generate a lot of ATP. So around 32 ATP are made just from this step. And remember, that's just for, half of a glucose molecule. So that's quite a bit. All right, and then you get ATP. So we talked a little bit about the electron transport chain when we talked about photosynthesis. And so essentially what you're doing is you have all of these different proteins that are embedded in the membrane, and it's going to be picking up all of these hydrogen molecules from your electron carriers and pushing them to one side of the gradient. And so what happens is you end up with all of these hydrogen, hydrogen ions on one side, and so they're going to want to flow back through. Okay, so we'll talk about cell transport a little bit later this week, but they don't like being there. So it's almost like putting a bunch of positive magnets on one side, of like a divider. They don't want to be there. They're going to want to flow back through. But the only way they can do that is if they come through this enzyme called ATP synthase. So ATP synthase is kind of like a little motor. It's going to take that ADP that we talked about at the very beginning, and it's going to add on another phosphate group. But that can only happen if you have your hydrogens that flow through. Okay. All right, and so that process is also known as chemiosmosis. All right, so let's look at this again. Let's see, I can get all my text up here. Okay, so if I look right here, here's my little hydrogen gradient. So I can see that my NADH is going to be dropping off those hydrogens, and FADH2 is going to drop it off as well from the citric acid cycle. All those hydrogens are going to get pushed to one side of that membrane, and they're going to want to come back through. The only way they can come back through is if they come back through ATP synthase. And so what that's going to do, that's going to cause ADP to phosphorylate to create ATP. So this is where oxygen is needed. Okay, so if I look right here, so I have my hydrogens coming through, but they have to stick to something. And so they have to stick to an oxygen. So if we think about it, hydrogen and oxygen naturally go very well together, and it's going to make water. So water is one of our byproducts from the electron transport chain. But if there's no oxygen there, that hydrogen is not going to be attracted to anything, so it's not going to come through. So like when we did our case study, cyanide is going to actually block that oxygen from being there. And so it's kind of like a magnet. The hydrogen is not attracted to any oxygen, and so the people in that case study that we learned about ended up kind of suffocating just because they weren't, creating enough ATP, and so their cells were essentially starved to death. And so you need oxygen there in order to bind to that hydrogen to create water. All right. So this is what our ATP synthase is going to do. As hydrogens go through, it's going to phosphorylate your ADP. So remember, phosphorylate means to add on that phosphate group, and you're going to create ATP. So those of you that are wondering, that PI, I stands for inorganic phosphate. And so inorganic phosphate is something that doesn't have a carbon. It's just a plain phosphate group like we learned in biochem, and it's going to attach to ADP. All right, so oxygen is completely required for this. This is an aerobic process. Without oxygen as that final electron acceptor, this won't happen. All right, so for my summary, okay, I get 34 ATP produced. I need to use those electrons and hydrogen ions from my Krebs cycle. Water is going to be my byproduct, and this is on the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, so total, if we add everything up, we're going to get about 36 ATP, and that's per half of a glucose molecule. Okay, so, and if you remember, you're getting a lot of glucose molecules in all of your food. So if there's not enough oxygen, okay, so what ends up happening? So those of you that maybe are not, in the greatest of shape, when there's not enough oxygen, you're going to, your muscles are going to cramp, you're going to start building up some lactic acid. And so we're going to talk about that really quick. So not enough oxygen, fermentation is going to occur. So those pyruvate molecules will stay in the cytoplasm. And so they'll go through a couple of different processes, and you can produce two different types of fermentation. So one is alcoholic and the other is lactic acid. So alcoholic fermentation, occurs in yeast. It can occur, with some sugars. And so this is how we get things like, the baker's yeast. This is how we get things like beer, wine, stuff like that. And so one of the byproducts from this is going to be carbon dioxide, and you're going to get ethanol. And so this causes, that dough or whatever it is, that liquid to bubble, and it's because it's producing excess ethanol, but in the process, or excess carbon dioxide, but in the process, it's also producing ATP. So lastly, oops, I'm speeding through this. What's it called? So lactic acid fermentation. So that's what happens with us. So if we don't have enough oxygen and we go and try to work out, and we're out of shape, lactic acid is going to build up in our muscles and it's going to cause us to get really sore. And that just happens to be one of the byproducts. It does go away, but it does take a while. All right, so hope you understand. Let me know.